Thank you, Hans, and good afternoon or good morning to everybody on the line today. Thank you very much for your interest. My name is Joe Ritchie. I'm one of the energy analysts in the Energy Efficiency Division here at the IEA. I'm joined by my colleague Kevin Lane.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm also at the International Energy Agency within the Energy Efficiency Division. Welcome, everyone.
And this afternoon what we're going to be talking about is the IEA's Efficient World Scenario, which was presented in the Energy Efficiency 2018 report. Now, Energy Efficiency 2018 is the sixth in the IEA's annual market report series. In this report, we first of all look at global trends and outlooks for energy efficiency. This includes an examination of some energy intensity and energy efficiency trends. We also look at policy progress and trends related to energy efficiency, and importantly we introduce our Efficient World Scenario, which is what we'll be talking about here today, and also discuss the Efficient World Strategy, which I'm seeing potentially we've got a few issues with sound, so I might just change up a bit. Hopefully that's now a bit better from the sound perspective. So as I was saying, we have our Efficient World Strategy, which we look at the policy recommendations and what we see as being required for the world to actually realise the energy efficiency potential as presented in the Efficient World Scenario. We also have sector chapters where we look at energy efficiency in the transport, buildings and industry sectors. We also look at energy efficiency, investment, finance and business models. And we have a sixth chapter where we look at energy efficiency in emerging economies, particularly Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico and South Africa. And these are the 6 economies that the IEA works with through our Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies program. And importantly, the report itself is freely available to download from iea.org/efficiency 2018. So it's a free report. And so if you're interested, we would encourage you to download that report. So what we're going to do today is to give a bit of an overview of some current energy efficiency trends, but importantly the Efficient World Scenario, and then look at some trends in the industry, buildings and transport sectors, and then touch on some energy efficiency investment trends. And hopefully at the end we'll have some time for a few questions as well. So in terms of current trends, one of the important headline messages that we highlight in the Energy Efficiency 2018 report is that global energy use is continuing to rise. And to get an understanding about what factors are contributing to the increase in global energy use, we use decomposition analysis, where we actually decompose energy use into the various factors that either put upwards pressure on energy use or put downwards pressure on energy use. And in this graph here, you can see a decomposition of final energy use in some of the world's major economies between 2000 and 2017. And you can see some of the factors that are actually putting upwards pressure on energy use. They include more buildings and appliances because people obviously are getting higher incomes and having greater purchasing power. There's more buildings being constructed and also more demand for energy services, which are being met by more appliances. That is putting upwards pressure on energy use. Another important factor is what we collectively refer to as less efficient transport patterns. And this includes things like people moving away from public transport or motorbikes towards passenger cars or their own personal vehicles. They're driving those vehicles more because they can afford to do so, or they're purchasing less efficient passenger cars like SUVs or other large vehicles, and that is putting upwards pressure on energy use. The largest factor is the increasing levels of economic activity across the economy. This is having a sizable impact on energy use, particularly as a result of growth in countries like China and India. We're seeing a lot of upwards pressure on energy use. But there are factors that are putting downwards pressure on energy use. The first of these is a shift in economic activity in particular a shift of activity away from energy-intensive sectors like iron and steel or cement manufacturing towards less energy-intensive food and beverage or textiles manufacturing, but also the services sector. That is putting downwards pressure on energy use. And importantly, there's also improvements in energy efficiency. But as you can see here, these improvements in energy efficiency, while substantial, are still being overwhelmed by these other factors, in particular increasing levels of economic growth. And that's obviously meaning that energy use is continuing to rise. But as I just highlighted, energy efficiency is still having a substantial impact. And to gauge that, we present in our report a bit of a counterfactual scenario about what global energy use and global emissions in 2017 would have been had it not been for efficiency improvements since 2000. So when we look at the graph on the left, we can see from the light blue dashed line that if it was not for improvements in energy efficiency since 2000, the world would have used 12% more energy in 2017. Turning to the graph on the right, we see for emissions that we would have had about 12% more emissions in 2017 had it not been for improvements in energy efficiency, and we would have also not seen the flattening of energy-related emissions that we saw between 2014 and 2016. Efficiency was the predominant factor that led to this flattening, and without it, we would not have, that would not have happened. From an energy use perspective, energy efficiency savings represent about the same amount of energy use as the European Union, and on emissions, it's about 4 billion tonnes of CO2. So quite substantial benefits are being achieved from energy efficiency. In terms of where these savings are coming from, just over 50% of the savings between 2000 and 2017 came from the global industry sector. In particular, China and North America were major drivers of that because of, in China's case, the investment in more efficient production capacity, but also very concerted policy efforts. The global building sector was responsible for just under 40% of the savings that we observed, with transport slightly less at just over 10%. Now, as we'll talk about in a few slides' time, this transport result is a reflection of the variable presence of transport fuel efficiency policies. And that obviously has been a factor that has contributed to that making a smaller contribution historically. But that's the historic trends, and I'm now going to pass over to Kevin, who will talk about the IEA's efficient world scenario, which looks to the potential for efficiency to 2040.
Thank you, Joe. So we've seen the historical improvements in energy efficiency, and what we'd like to do now is to show you what a potential future world could look like with improved energy efficiency. So we think there's quite a significant amount of untapped energy efficiency potential out there. So what we'd like to do is answer a specific question: what would happen by 2040 if all countries realized the economically viable energy efficiency potential that is available today? When we say economically viable, in this scenario, we meant it to be any sort of upfront investment cost that would repay over the lifetime of the measure. So that is using today's technologies essentially at today's costs. So in some respects, this could be considered a conservative estimate because innovation may lower the costs. It may also deliver more efficiency into the future. It might also be considered a little bit difficult to realize all those savings in terms of the financial benefit. However, this is our efficient world scenario, and that's how we've laid it out. And what I'll show you now is just what we think the impact of this would be in terms of the economy, the energy system, and also the environment. So if we look at the big picture going forward, what does the efficient world scenario look like? What we have here is three curves, one on GDP, one on energy, and one on intensity, and these have been indexed to 100 in the year 2000. And what it's showing is the intensity, which is essentially a GDP per energy measure, is improving to around 3% per annum into the future. And this improvement in intensity delivers well, it means that we can keep energy consumption essentially stable, despite GDP pretty much doubling over this period. So how does that 3% per annum energy intensity look like? So on the very right, you can see for the EWS scenario, the efficient world scenario, we need 3% per annum improvements every year in intensity, and historically that's only been achieved once in the last 5 years, and in the last few years that's actually been declining. So it's a bit of a concern, that decline, but it is something that appears achievable based on historical trends in intensity. Right, if we go forward, what does this 3% per annum intensity mean in terms of increased or reduced energy consumption? And what we see here is, in terms of energy consumption, historically efficiency has meant that we've had lower consumption by, say, I don't know, 20, 30 exajoules, but consumption has risen due to increased activity, as Joe showed earlier. But we think that improvements in efficiency could reduce future consumption by about 30%, meaning that by 2040 energy consumption will be nearly flat, pretty much the same as today, at just over 400 exajoules. Okay, what we're showing here is the potential for energy savings across the 3 different sectors. The darker colors are what we think current policies, so policies that are in the have already been announced and likely to be implemented, so that will include nationally determined contributions from each of the countries around the world. They're included in this dark color blocks here. The hatched ones at the top, they're the ones that we think are still being unrealized. Those are economically viable energy savings that aren't being realized by potential energy policies. So our aim is to try and see how we can realize those ones. And to realize those energy savings in industry, we think those are more likely to be in the energy intensive industries, so the less historically ones like steel, cement, etc., and they're more likely to be end users like heat pumps and motor-driven systems. For transport, most of those efficiency savings are coming from more efficient passenger vehicles and trucks, and also some switch towards electric vehicles. Whilst in buildings, we think that most of those savings are going to come from space heating, cooling, appliances, and importantly on the envelope of buildings as well. Okay, and what's the outcome of this energy savings? In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we expect currently there's about 32.5 gigatons of energy-related CO2 emissions. By improving energy consumption, that we could make greenhouse gas emissions fall into the future just through these efficiency measures. And as well as greenhouse gas emissions reducing, we can also show that air pollutants will also decrease as well through lower use of fossil fuels in certain types of electricity generation, and also fuel emissions from cars. So we see that PM 2.5, NOx and SOx are reduced in this EWS scenario. We've also done some addition analysis with IEA, where we put it through their gains model to show the impact of these air pollutants on reduced mortality as well. So we've got some additional analysis in the report which you can look at. The next question is, how does this efficient world scenario compare to other scenarios that the IEA does? In the IEA, some of all, you know that the WEO team, our World Energy Outlook, produces a new policy scenario and a sustainable development scenario. The new policy scenario is also a reference scenario, what we thought could happen. The sustainable development scenario is one that achieves all Paris climate goals, but also some other sustainable development goals as well. And if we look at the EWS, or the efficiency component of reaching those goals, efficiency is actually a major contribution towards meeting these sustainable development scenario and all our sustainable and Paris goals as well. So it really is energy efficiency is the first fuel in this future world. In terms of finance, how does that look across some sectors? Here's a few examples. If we look across the economy, so for EU, China and India, they could expect to save about $700 billion from avoided imports of oil and coal. For industry, we'd expect their fuel bills or energy bills to be about $600 billion less across the globe, and for households, we expect them also to be saving a similar amount of money into the future in terms of their energy bills. Also importantly, the efficient world scenario fully delivers on the efficiency target of the Sustainable Development Goals. That's 7.3. So what I'd like to do now is just take you through each of the three sectors, and I'll let Joe go through transport, and then I'll come back to buildings.
Great, thanks Kevin. And yes, so you've just seen there obviously an overview of the efficient world scenario and some of the global level benefits. And as Kevin said, what we're going to do now is to talk through those benefits at the end use level. And we're going to focus on transport, buildings and industry, which were the three sector-specific chapters in the Energy Efficiency 2018 report. And in each of the sector chapters we have this graph here. And what it does is it compares the annual or the average annual energy efficiency improvement across various subsectors, in this case within transport, between since 2000 to now, and then in the efficient world scenario, so between now and 2040 effectively. So this is the transport sector, and you can see the various subsectors here. We can see that historically, as shown by the dark blue line, that aviation and international shipping have seen fairly strong rates of annual energy efficiency improvement. In aviation, this is a reflection of the increasing capacity factors, so more people flying because of low-cost airlines, and also effectively better technology improvements within airlines. And within international shipping, it's actually a reflection of increased activity and therefore greater load and capacity factors within international shipping. But improvements historically have been much less in passenger light-duty vehicles, essentially passenger cars, and road freight, essentially trucks. We can see that in these cases, the average annual efficiency improvement since 2000, as shown by the dark blue bars here, has been quite low. But in the efficient world scenario, the savings could be a lot higher. In passenger cars, we would actually see the average annual rate of efficiency improvement near 3%, with a similar rate of improvement in road freight, in trucks. In aviation and shipping, we would again see strong rates of improvement, but across the entirety of the transport sector, as we see from the pie chart on the right, that it is actually trucks and passenger cars that will be responsible for the majority of the potential energy savings that would result from improvements in efficiency. So we do actually see a lot of potential from improvements in road transport, and particularly improvements in passenger cars and trucks. And the drivers for this, for passenger cars, are the movement obviously towards more efficient internal combustion engine vehicles, but importantly the adoption of more efficient electric vehicles. That's obviously a very important factor. Within road freight, it's driven by things like improved logistics and improved capacity factors within trucks, but also the introduction of mandatory fuel efficiency policies, some of which have been introduced in about 5 countries at the moment, but there's obviously a lot more potential for fuel efficiency standards within trucks to drive gains into the future. And I mentioned at the very start of the presentation that one of the factors that has led to transport having a smaller contribution to historic efficiency savings has been the variable presence of vehicle fuel efficiency standards, particularly for passenger cars. What you can see here on this graph is the actual amount of energy use or transport energy use that is covered by some sort of mandatory energy efficiency policy. So in this case, the amount of transport energy use that is subject to a fuel economy standard. We can see that in countries like the US or Japan or China that have both fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks, that there's in some cases the majority, over 50%, of transport energy use in these countries, in these markets, is covered by some sort of fuel economy standard. But that's obviously an amount that's very variable. We can see that in some of the emerging markets like India, Indonesia and Brazil, that coverage is a lot lower. In India, this might rise into the future as more fuel economy standards come into place. But in Brazil and India, in Indonesia and Brazil, there currently aren't any standards at all. And so we do see there as being scope for more policy action to drive savings within the transport sector. And people obviously ask why we continually harp or focus on the impact of fuel economy standards. And the reason is that because they are proven to have been effective. What you can see here on this graph, if you look at the graph on the left, is what passenger car fuel or energy use would have been without fuel economy standards. This is the red bar. We can see that if we did not have fuel economy standards in place between 2000 and 2017, that the global transport sector, or passenger cars in particular, would have been using about 1 million barrels of oil a day extra. We also recognise that there's actually a lot more improvement to be gained from strengthening these fuel economy standards. We estimate that if all countries in the world had actually implemented the best-in-class fuel economy standards for passenger cars, which we've equated to the Japanese standards, that the world would have actually used 2.2 million barrels of oil a day less of oil in 2017. So we would have actually avoided over 2 million barrels of oil a day additional energy use as a result of strengthening fuel economy standards for cars. And this importance will continue to grow into the future. We can see from the graph on the right that what would happen to passenger car fuel use if the world implemented no new policies. This is the large red bar on the left. And we can see that we'd actually see over 4 million barrels of oil a day extra of passenger car energy use if there were no new policies or no strengthened policies introduced between now and 2040. But if we saw more policies introduced or an existing policy strengthened, as is the case in the Efficient World Scenario, or the EWS, this additional energy use would actually be completely avoided. We would avoid an additional 4 million barrels of oil a day extra energy use in 2040 because of the efficiency potential that exists. And this is driven by standards and also by incentives to increase the adoption of electric vehicles. And what you can see on this graph here, on this table here, is a summary of the Efficient World Strategy. And the Efficient World Strategy for transport is effectively comprised of, first of all, what we see as being possible from the cost-effective energy efficiency potential that exists within the transport sector, and the key policy actions that we believe would be required if the world is to realise this existing potential. So in terms of what's possible, looking at the left-hand column of this table, we see that in the transport sector, energy demand could actually stay flat between now and 2040, which is quite incredible, and that's despite a doubling of activity levels. And as I highlighted in the first slide of our transport look, passenger cars and trucks actually offer the majority of savings, and therefore we see those as being very, very important for driving efficiency gains into the future. In terms of some of the key policy actions, well, as I highlighted in the previous slide, we do need to see an improvement in the coverage and strength of transport policies, not only for cars and trucks, but also for other non-road modes. So in particular, shipping and aviation policies are in some cases global in reach, and shipping has some global policies. Aviation has a few, but not to the same extent, and so there is also scope for action there. We also see an important policy step as the provision of incentives to support the adoption and sustainable use of efficient vehicles. In particular, we see there as being a need for incentives to encourage the adoption of electric vehicles, which will not only decarbonise the transport fleet, but also improve its efficiency. And finally, we highlight there is a need for information to support consumers to adopt more efficient vehicles and operate them more efficiently, and also look at modal shift as well. So this is people maybe taking the public transport instead of driving their car, or using other forms of transport as an alternative to less efficient modes. And so therefore we have a combination of regulation, incentives and information that we see as being necessary to realise this efficiency gains or the potential efficiency within the transport sector. I'll now pass back over to Kevin, who will talk about buildings and appliances.
Thanks, Joe. So back into buildings. And what we see here on the first chart is energy consumption by globally by buildings from 2000 to 2017. And we can see that energy consumption has risen from maybe 100 to 120 exajoules. That is despite intensity improving by 1.6% per year. By intensity here we mean essentially energy per floor area. In the efficient world scenario, that intensity figure will ramp up a bit to something like 2.6% and means that energy consumption in the building sector could remain flat, maybe even decline a little bit. And that's despite the amount of floor area being 60% larger in 2040 than it is in 2017. Also that there's 20% greater population by 2040 and the amount of energy using equipment inside the building being dramatically larger than it is today. So if we look at this in a little bit more detail to understand where some of these future energy savings are likely to come from a cost assessment basis, we expect in the efficient world scenario that most of these savings are going to come from space heating, water heating and space cooling. In terms of each of the end users, we've put those in on the left-hand side, and these are the average percentage improvements we expect historically and also into the future. So into the future, the efficiency improvements are all larger than they were historically, and the interesting ones to note, I suppose, are the space cooling, the appliances ones, where they appear to be negative here, and the reason they're negative at the moment is because there's been a dramatic increase in the ownership of these products from the year 2000 up to 2017. So that is why it's showing as a negative figure on this intensity improvement chart. In terms of the space heating, it's not only the equipment that we expect to improve in efficiency, it's taking care of the envelope as well, being one of the key measures that we need to account for. I'll dig deeper into one of those in a moment. So before going into space cooling, I'll just show you what's happening with the coverage of policies across the building sector. What we have here is a proportion of energy consumption that's covered by policy measures that have mandatory requirements in them. So for the building sector, that means mandatory building codes for the fabric of the building or the heating equipment, but also minimum energy performance standards for appliances and lighting. So what you can see in this chart here is that over time that the amount of energy covered by such policy measures has been increasing, and the energy that's covered the most, or the end use that's covered the most, is for lighting and space cooling. So if you look at energy regulators around the world, these have been the end users that have been easier to target. It's a lot easier to put MEPS on minimum energy performance standards on air conditioning units, and maybe have something on lighting as well. So the lighting is also due to the phase out of incandescent lamps, which a lot of countries went through about 5-10 years ago. The other interesting one there on the bottom is cooking. This is energy consumption, and there's actually a lot of biomass cooking still goes on in the world, and it's a very large chunk of energy, and that's why that looks particularly low, because biomass cooking is a very inefficient way of cooking. But overall, we think that about still under 40% of the energy consumption of buildings is covered by building codes or MEPS. So there's clearly potential to improve that into the future, as well as improving the strength of some of these regulations as well. So for lighting, most of the regulations might only be around 12 lumens per watt for an incandescent lamp, and that could be ratcheted up or have other related programs. And we'll just go back to the space cooling one. This is one of our blind spots. We wrote a special report on this last year, which is the future of cooling, but this also appears in this report as well. And what it's showing is that the dramatic rise in cooling that's happened since 2000 to 2017, it's been quite an explosion in terms of the ownership of such products, and efficiency has only partially offset that energy consumption. And we expect that rise to increase further into 2040, especially in Southeast Asia. So we expect China, India, Indonesia, and warm countries that are increasing in wealth to want to adopt such technologies. So we expect a massive rise in ownership and consumption from these products. And without efficiency, the implications for energy consumption will be quite severe. So in the efficient world scenario, we expect the efficiency of air conditioners to double within this period, which will essentially counteract that increase in energy growth. Without this efficiency, it's not only the energy consumption, but it is a real issue because of the time of day. So the peak energy use, electricity demand, will be quite problematic for most grids around the world. And we already saw even in Australia a couple of months ago, the impact that that could have on the grid, just a rapid rise in air conditioning from a couple of warm days. So back to our efficient world strategy. This is the equivalent slide to the one that Joe showed for transport. On the left-hand side, we say what we think is possible, and we think that energy use could be stable, even though we've got 60% more building space expected over the next 20 odd years and more people and more equipment, so that's quite an impressive task to undertake. It's going to be achieved mainly through making space heating, water heating and air cooling a lot more efficient than it is today. That's where most of the savings will have to be achieved. In terms of the key policy actions or the types of measures that governments and other actors will need to undertake, they will mostly come from typical existing types of policies. So we expect building codes and minimum energy performance standards. So these types of policies that are quite well known, we expect them to still continue to work. They'll have to be covered in more countries, but also the requirements of those ratcheted up so that they are more effective and have a greater impact on products and buildings being sold and retrofitted. Also, we probably expect some sort of incentives or other sort of help to make sure that consumers and homeowners buy more efficient equipment, but also to undertake deep retrofits. So it's undertaking the deep retrofits that we see as the most challenging part of this for the building sector, and clearly some sort of incentives will be needed to help that happen, and other measures as well. Also, some sort of improved quality of energy performance information and tools, which may be aided by more digitalization and better equipment coming on. So this new phase of digitalization, I think, will be quite useful to help better understand what's going on, but may also bring forward new business models. Might mean ESCOs and other types of models are more likely to happen. So with that, I think we'll move to our final of the three sectors, which is the industrial sector, and I'll hand back to Joe.
All right, thanks, Kevin. And yes, so looking now at the industry sector, and the first slide here, we see on the left-hand side of these charts, we can see energy intensity trends for the manufacturing industries. And what we can see is, first of all, gross value added in the light blue, energy use in the dark blue, and energy intensity in the light green and dashed line there. And this is an index trend since 2000. And what we see is that energy intensity, or manufacturing energy intensity, in the countries that are covered, so these are the world's major economies, has actually improved by about 25% since 2000. And we can see that it's really been this decade when we've seen much more sustained improvements in energy intensity. That's a reflection in many cases of action within China, which is home to the world's largest industry sector. And as we look out to 2040, we can actually see that energy intensity and energy efficiency improvement continue to grow. So what we can see from the graph on the right and in the red line there is that, as shown by the efficient world scenario, that cost-effective energy efficiency measures could actually lead to an improvement in manufacturing energy intensity of nearly 45% by 2040 compared to current levels. So there has obviously been strong progress and reasonable progress seen since 2000 in terms of manufacturing energy efficiency, but we'd actually see that step up even more into the future because of the cost-effective potential that still exists. In terms of the look at the industry subsectors, and again we have one of these graphs here where we look at historical trends and trends into the future through the efficient world scenario. Within the industry sector, we look at 5 key energy intensive sectors: iron and steel, chemicals, cement, pulp and paper, aluminium. And we also look at this aggregation of other industry sectors, which we refer to as other industries. But this is essentially those less energy intensive sectors like food and beverage manufacturing or textile manufacturing, which are actually large employers and large in terms of their gross value added, which is also growing as well, but less energy intensive in terms of the actual industrial processes. What we see from the dark blue lines, dark blue bars, is that historically energy efficiency improvements across these industry sectors has been variable. So we can see that in the cement sector, because of more efficient production capacity being deployed in India and China, that there's been quite a strong improvement in energy intensity. But that's been less so in the iron and steel sector. But as we look to the future in our efficient world scenario, we would see efficiency continue to improve across all sectors. But this is most apparent in the iron and steel sector, where as a result of increases in metal recycling, which use electric arc furnaces, which are much less energy intensive, we could see substantial efficiency gains. And also, and importantly, we could see substantial efficiency gains in those other industry sectors, which, as I mentioned, is that aggregation of those less energy intensive sectors. And it's interesting here is that these other industries, or less energy intensive industry sectors, actually represent 70% of the potential efficiency gains within the industry sector. You can see that from the graph on the right, where the other industries, represented by the light blue bar, the light blue section of the donut chart there, dominate in terms of their contribution to energy savings. And as Kevin said earlier on, the two major, I suppose, technology interventions that are associated with these efficiency gains are, first of all, the deployment of electric heat pumps to displace or replace existing oil boilers or gas boilers, and also the improvement in electric motor driven systems. And there are two components to improving electric motor driven systems. The first of those is obviously improving the efficiency of the motor unit itself, and that's an efficiency measure that is greatly aided by minimum energy performance standards. So important policy aspects there, which I'll touch on in the next slide. The other important aspect that for improving the energy efficiency of electric motor driven systems is the introduction of energy management systems, such as that described by the ISO 50001 standard. And energy management systems are important because they consider energy saving and optimise energy saving across the entirety of the industrial system, and don't just look at a specific item of technology. And so they ensure that a company has the systems and the processes in place to effectively monitor its energy use, identify opportunities to improve energy efficiency, and implement and track those opportunities to ensure that you have continual improvement. And that's obviously another important aspect to unlocking these efficiency gains within the industry sector. But I'll go back to the motor unit, and I mentioned that a key policy mechanism there has been minimum energy performance standards for electric motors. What we can see in the graph on the left is the amount of electric motor energy use that is actually subject to minimum energy performance standards. The dark blue bars on this chart represent the actual amount of energy that's covered. So what we can see is that in 2017, just over 25% of global electric motor energy use was covered by some sort of mandatory energy efficiency policy. But what's important to note here is that electric motors are very long-lived assets. I mean, they can be in operation for well over 20 years, sometimes even over 30 years. And as a result, there are still motors that are in operation today that were installed prior to the introduction of minimum energy performance standards. And so therefore, these policies have not had their full impact. We have not realised the full potential efficiency gains that minimum energy performance standards could actually bring. And to highlight that, if the world's entire motor stock was to turn over overnight, then we would see nearly 60% of global motor electricity use actually being covered by some sort of mandatory energy efficiency policy. So that shows you that the policy coverage and the policy scope is a lot greater than what we think. In terms of the countries where policies are quite apparent, well, in the USA and Canada, because of the introduction of standards prior to 2000, they have a large amount of their stock covered by minimum energy performance standards. In other countries, the coverage is a bit less, but importantly to note here from these black dots that you can see on this graph on the right, that in countries like Japan, Korea, and in regions like the European Union that have not only introduced but strengthened standards since 2000, that we do expect more savings to come and more coverage to grow as the motor stock turns over in those countries. The other important measure that I mentioned, obviously, was for electric motor-driven systems was energy management systems. And I did mention the ISO 50001 standard, which is a global energy management system standard and is an important component of many industrial energy efficiency policies. And what we do in the Energy Efficiency 2018 report is that we track the number of ISO 50001 certifications as reported by the International Organisation for Standardisation. What you can see from the graph on the left is that the number of ISO 50001 certificates is continuing to grow. And it really is Europe, particularly Germany, that is a driving force behind this growth in certifications. But an important observation is that in 2017, we actually saw a slowdown in the rate of coverage growth. When we look at the graph here on the right, we actually compare the number of ISO 50001 certificates, which is the dark blue line, to ISO 14001 and ISO 9001 certificates, which are similar management system standards and environmental system standards. And what you can see here is that ISO 50001 was actually tracking in line with those standards in its first 5 or 6 years. But last year, in 2017, that is, the actual rate did not increase by an amount that was similar to previous trends. It did not follow the same path for ISO 14001 and ISO 9001. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that companies aren't adopting energy management. It just obviously means that they're not getting the ISO 50001 certification. But an important factor that will drive future growth of certification of ISO 50001 will be its adoption by Chinese companies. Chinese companies are the largest certificate holders for ISO 14001 and 9001, but for 50001 it's still Germany. And so if we are to see more growth, then we do need to see adoption in China if it is to reach if ISO 50001 certification is to reach the same level as 14001 or 9001. On to the Efficient World strategy for the industry sector, and in terms of what's possible by 2040, we highlight that in the industry sector, value added per unit of energy could actually double. For our North American colleagues, this means a doubling of energy productivity, with, as I said at the start of this section, less energy intensive industry offering the majority, in this case 70% of the potential energy savings. In terms of the key policy action, we do advocate for the need for expanding and strengthening standards for key industrial equipment, particularly electric heat pumps and also motors that offer a large amount of savings within the industry sector. We also highlight the need for incentives to encourage the adoption of energy management systems, which will obviously drive efficiency gains across the entirety of industrial systems. And on a training and capacity building aspect, we do highlight the importance of things like industry networks, which have become quite popular in Germany and other parts of Europe, and also the use of things like case studies and training to enhance awareness and capacity of industry to actually deliver the efficiency potential that exists today. So the final thing we want to touch on before we go to some questions is energy efficiency investment, because all of the trends that we're seeing today and all of the potential that we could see in the future will need to be funded. In terms of current levels of energy efficiency investment, what we highlight in the Energy Efficiency 2018 report is that global energy efficiency investment grew marginally in 2017 to US $236 billion. That's a 3% increase on levels in 2016, and from the graph on the right we can actually see that it is the building sector, as represented by the sort of dark blue outer ring of that chart there, that represents the majority, in this case around 140 billion or just under 6% of total energy efficiency investment in 2017. Now, the reason for the building sector being such a large source of energy efficiency investment is a reflection of the fact that it has a lot of low cost and easily scaled energy efficiency measures. So I'm talking about things like insulation, double glazing windows, lighting retrofits, and also improvements to HVAC systems. Those represent fairly low cost and also low risk opportunities that have been unlocked in many cases by building codes and other policy intervention. However, when we look to the future, we actually need to see more energy efficiency investment if we are to realise the potential of the efficient world scenario. What you can see on this graph here is what we would need to see annual energy efficiency investment levels be in order to realise the efficient world scenario. The dark blue bar on the far left is current investment levels. Between now and 2025, in order to realise the efficient world scenario, those annual investment levels would need to double. And then after 2025, they would then need to double again. So we would need to see, obviously, a substantial step up in global energy efficiency investment to realise the potential that exists today. But it's important to note that all of this investment is cost effective. The report actually highlights that across all of the efficiency measures within the efficient world scenario, that they pay back by an average factor of 3 over their lifetime. So for every dollar invested in energy efficiency, you get $3 back in energy savings, and that doesn't even consider the other benefits of energy efficiency, like productivity benefits or health benefits that we have highlighted at the IEA before, which will actually create additional gains in addition to just the energy savings that are possible. In order to realise these efficiency gains, we do highlight the need for policy to facilitate finance and business model innovation. Business models like energy service companies, or ESCOs, which Kevin mentioned, are a growing source of energy efficiency investment and innovation within the efficiency sector, and there's a lot more potential to grow that into the future, and we see that policy can have an important role in creating an environment that will facilitate that investment. So that's all we had in terms of our presentation on the efficient world scenario. A couple of concluding remarks here. We see that the efficient world scenario shows a world with double the GDP, more people, more building space, but lower emissions than we have today, and effectively not that much more energy use. We do see obviously that efficiency can reduce a lot of impacts of air pollution, can reduce imports and consumer bills, and also deliver on the SDG relating to energy efficiency. As I highlighted in the previous slide, all of the efficiency opportunities presented in the efficient world scenario are cost effective using technology that is available today, but we do require a step up in policy action. As I highlighted, investments need to double now and then double again after 2025, but they will pay back by a factor of 3 on energy savings alone. And in terms of all the policies that we've advocated for through our efficient world strategy, it's important to note that there are lots of good examples of these policies today. They have been implemented in some form in some country before or at present, and so there's a good basis for further expansion into the future. We don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel to realise the energy efficiency potential that exists today. There's a lot of potential that is already reachable through existing policies. So that's all we had, and I'm obviously ready for some questions and answers now, so I'll hand back over to Hans.